All right, welcome back. We're going to cover chapter, what is this, 11 today, special populations. I did get, for those of you that met Steve or listened to Steve Annan's podcast, he's the president of the New Hampshire Hospital Association. He's agreed to be a guest speaker for our policy class, which is, I think, April 28th. So he's going to dial in for a little bit, talk to you a little bit about the work he does and kind of what his view on policy is. He's been, for those of you that didn't listen to his interview, he's been in the policy world for, I don't know, 30 years or so. He's a good guy, very supportive of UNH, even though he's a Jayhawk. He went to Kansas. All right, so today we're going to talk about special populations. I'm going to hit some highlights. Obviously, as usual, your book covers a lot of material. I'm going to cover some things from that I think are important. I'm going to cover some other things that your book doesn't really talk about. We'll kind of skim over the overall world. But the thing to remember about healthcare is, and the thing that we're talking a lot about as a society, is people are different, right? People are different. Every person is different. They're different for a whole range of reasons. There are some commonalities based on your different characteristics that you might have. Men and women require different healthcare, obviously, males and females, right? But other people from different classes have different behaviors. We'll talk a little bit about that. You can aggregate people by race and ethnicity, and we can see some patterns there. But at the end of the day, every individual person is a human being, and they have unique needs, unique special needs. And a good healthcare provider treats every person that walks into their office or gets brought to them as a unique individual human being. And you don't, as a provider, you don't want to make the error of treating a human being as a category. So we'll talk about some special populations today. So that's the theme of the course of the chapter, where we are going to look at categories of individuals and some of the commonalities that they share. But I just kind of want to come back to that idea of, and I want you to keep it in mind, particularly those of you who have a future in healthcare delivery, that every person that comes to you for help is an individual, and you need to treat them as such. So so I've asked you to watch a short video. This, I think you'll meet Nunzio. Nunzio is a trans man, so he's a female to male trans. In the video, they talk about him being treated for polycystic ovary syndrome. Women with polycystic ovary syndrome produce higher than normal amounts of male hormones. So normally this would be a problem. It's a problem for a number of reasons. One of which is if you have too many male hormones, you won't be able to get pregnant if you're a female, right? Nunzio, as a trans man, doesn't want to be pregnant, right? But his providers were treating him as if maybe someday he would want to get pregnant. So the question there is, and this is a challenge, right, with healthcare, is sometimes your patients come to you and they present a problem, and you may or may not, as a provider, may or may not agree with them and their own evaluation. So in the last chapter, in the last class, last week, right, I talked to you about my friend Eric, who has schizophrenia. He is sometimes involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. If you asked him and took him, is there something wrong? He would tell you, if he was having a psychotic break, he would tell you some version of reality. And you, as a psychiatrist, would have the responsibility to say, actually, you're wrong, and you need help. You need to be here. And so I'm going to commit you against your will and force you to undergo medical care. So there are circumstances that where society grants the provider the authority to go against the wishes of the individual. But that is an exception, not the rule, right? That is an exception, not the rule. It requires a court order to do that. So the court will listen to the psychiatrist or psychologist or other person who is, depending on the state, is authorized to order, treatment against your will. Sometimes parents will want to either get treatment or deny treatment to their children based on a variety of cultural elements, such as religious beliefs. So I forget which particular Christian sect it is, but they don't believe in getting blood transfusions. So there's been a number of cases where a child is brought to the ED, has been in a serious trauma, has had some sort of trauma, maybe a car accident, has had blood loss, and the parents don't want the kid to get blood because they believe that the child will then not be able to go to heaven or whatever their beliefs are, but they deeply believe this, right? This is a deeply held belief, a deeply enough held belief that they are prepared to allow their child to die rather than get that health care. Because they believe, in this case, I think it's Seventh-day Adventist, but don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. They believe that if the child gets a blood transfusion, they won't be able to go to heaven. And so if you're trading off, the chance of everlasting, and they believe, right, this is a cultural belief, they believe that their child, if the child dies, the child will go to heaven because it's just a child anyway. And so they'll go to heaven and live forever. But if you give them a blood transfusion, then they won't be able to go to heaven. So this is like, so if you enter into their belief system about and enter into their belief that heaven is real and that everlasting life is real, and now you are preparing to take that from their child, right? That's their belief system when they present. And so they don't want you to do that because that's their view of reality. And so the court has often come down and said, you have freedom of religion up until a point. You have the freedom to guide your child and guide your child's healthcare up until a point, and then society will make that decision. So now we go back to, but sometimes society will disagree with you and take that right from you as an individual or you as a parent, right? So one of the special populations we could talk about are religious groups that believe in particular things about healthcare and how healthcare should be delivered. Not getting immunizations is another example, right? So we go back to that model of disease and illness, right? Where you as an individual have a perspective about are you ill or not, and society has a perspective about whether you are ill or not. And sometimes those things overlap, and we generally get along at that point. Sometimes an individual says they're not ill and society says they are. So a lot of psychiatric illness is in that realm, right? Where the individual believes that, there are really people following them around and trying to kill them. And the psychiatrist says, no, probably not. And the fact that you just tried to, steal a car and drive down the highway at 100 miles an hour to get away from your imaginary pursuers makes you a danger to yourself and society. So we're going to take away your individual freedoms and put you into a psychiatric hospital and put you under medication that you don't want, to take. And we're not going to let you out until we know that you're stabilized and on this medication. And then when we do let you out, we may require by court order that you get monitored by a psychiatrist in an outpatient setting to make sure that you are in fact taking your medications. So we got that model that I presented to you way back in the first chapter, maybe the second lecture, is a useful model in terms of thinking about in special populations as well, right? Because special populations may think of themselves differently. So you run into this conflict. So here we have an individual who believes that he is male, he's a man, right? because male and female are biological measures. So he believes he's a male. He would like to be treated as a male. He is biologically female, but he has a condition that ordinarily would be treated in cisgendered women in order to maintain their fertility. And he is saying, I do not want that. And so we run into this conflict about how his provider is not listening to him and is trying to treat him in a way that he doesn't want to be treated, right? So part of the problem with this is this condition, polycystic ovary syndrome, is not just associated with higher levels of testosterone, which this person is probably taking in order to help with the transition from female to male. But this polycystic ovary syndrome is also associated with other comorbidities like diabetes and heart disease. So now you have a provider who's trying to balance, again, the individual's wishes, their belief about, maybe the provider's belief about the fact that, you know, this person is biologically female and should maintain their ability to have a child if they so desire at some point, because maybe Nunzio will change his mind later on and decide, you know, I really regret having self-sterilized, right, and not being able to have a child. So the provider has to bear that in mind as well, particularly with transitioning, right? Is today you may feel I'm really a trans opposite gender, and so I want treatments that will allow me to transition to this other gender. But 10 years from now, you might change your mind. And depending on what we've done to you, what the provider has done to you or allowed you or provided to you, you may not be able to undo what you have done. Right. So transgenderism is a real problem and a challenge for a provider who's trying to behave ethically. And there's some disagreements about this, right, as to how far you should go. Should you, if the person comes in and says, if a biological female presents to you and says, I am actually a man, give me testosterone, I want a double mastectomy, right, which is the removal of the breasts, also referred to as top surgery in transgender circles. I want all these things. Well, the problem is if you are a young woman, not yet fully developed, because your development continues into your mid-20s. If you are a young female and you start taking testosterone, your voice will change, your facial structure will change, your body structure will change. And there's no undoing that, right? So if at 15 you decide, or 16 or 17, you decide to transition to male, start taking testosterone, your body will undergo changes that there is no reversing. There's no like getting off testosterone and your body reverting back to what it was. It won't do that. So when you have things that you can reverse easily, like hair color, you know, haircut or something like that, you know, there's no real ethical challenge there. Just, you know, fine. You want to shave your head? Go ahead, shave your head. It'll grow back tomorrow. You know, it doesn't matter. But if you cut your breasts off, there's no getting them back. Right? That's that. It's done. So providers have to balance, you know, the rights of the individual. And I believe rights of individuals is near absolute. It's not perfectly absolute, but it's near absolute. Right? But the rights of the individual to guide their own lives against what the provider believes is their responsibility, the provider's responsibility of care. So we have these special populations like Nunzio, right, who talks about his experience as if he wanted to maybe someday have kids. Well, today he presents to you as a patient who assures you never wants to have children. Yeah, but what about 10 years from now? So there are challenges with that, right? But they have, but people who present as transgender have a right to be listened to and treated appropriately. So there's a lot of discrimination in the lives of LGBT people. And you can see a bunch of different statistics here, right? Rejected by a family member or friend. If you come out to a family, you're likely to face some, concern or resistance, or maybe even outright, rejection from your family. People who are identified as LGBT have been threatened or physically attacked, right? They've been treated unfairly by an employer. And I would tell you that, gay, lesbian, bisexual, when I was a kid, when I was your age, it was much more of a stigma. Today it's like it's night and day almost, right? Transgender is and transphobia today is much more like what homophobia was like when I was your age. So the conflict and the concern that even I'm just now expressing, like, if you listen to this tape 20 years from now, what I just said about being concerned about trans people maybe changing their mind might sound like a horrifying thing. It might sound like a horrifying thing to some people today. It happens to be what I think. My concern would be life is long. I've changed my mind about my life many times. Most of the people I know who make it to 50 have changed their minds about a lot of things, right? And this is one of those things that you can't undo. But transgender people still face a lot of intense discrimination at a level much more harsh than gay and lesbians. And in healthcare, they also report prejudices from providers. Some providers refuse to touch them, use abusive language, aren't willing to use their preferred pronouns if they're trans, and so forth. So I have a friend, colleague, if you will, he's a gay physician at Exeter, and he has been leading the efforts at the hospital to help providers gain a better understanding of the LGBT community, and he is in particular is being sought out by members of this community because he understands their needs. And I have a number of gay and lesbian friends, and they do have different needs, right? They have different, because they engage in sexual activity that is different than heterosexuals. There are different health conditions that they are more likely to encounter and more likely to experience than heterosexual people. So it's important for your provider to know that about you, if that's a fact. And in order for you to be, and then you need to be comfortable. They need to be open enough to listen and treat you with the respect that you deserve as an individual. Because even if they disagree with you, their obligation is to care for you and to treat you as an individual. So some disparities include higher levels of HIV and other STDs, anxiety and depression, largely because of the way they're treated in society. A lot of folks are more susceptible to suicidal ideation, more susceptible when you have anxiety and depression, you are more susceptible to substance abuse, including smoking. And then they tend to not have, family support, peer support to some degree. They have a higher level of homelessness. All of these things kind of combine to create a real challenge. So there are clinics, particularly in larger cities, that get known in these communities as being open to caring for these individuals. Harder in more rural areas where values tend to be more rigid and conservative. Right? Now, something of interest. This is a study from Great Britain. They have a gender reassignment clinic. Again, we talk about Great Britain has their National Health Service. So they have a this is the sex ratio in children and adolescents referred to the Gender Identity Development Service in the UK between 2009 and 2016. And what you can see is a dramatic increase in, so the yellow is adolescent females presenting as trans. The gray is adolescent males presenting as trans. The orange down here is children, female children presenting as trans, and male children presenting as trans. And what's interesting, and I'm sorry I couldn't find, I was looking for this data last night and I couldn't find more current data, but what I'm reading is in the literature is that we have seen, and you can see it here, this demonstrates it adequately enough, the number of young people presenting as trans has spiked in the last 15 years or so. And so the numbers have continued to increase, particularly as you can see the growth among adolescents and in particular among young women has grown dramatically. Historically, the prevalence of trans, it's called gender dysphoria, right? The prevalence of gender dysphoria in the population was much more male. So the ratio is much more male to female transitions than female to male. And historically, such ideation, so gender dysphoria typically took place in childhood rather than in adolescence. And so what we've seen in the last 12, 15 years is a rapid rise in the number of adolescents presenting as trans, and in particular, a reversal in the prevalence among sexes with many more adolescent females presenting as trans than adolescent. And so this is an odd thing that has not been adequately explained. And the desire to provide acceptance for these people in some ways is preventing the study of why are we seeing this change now, right? So when we see a rapid change in something like the presentation of any sort of condition, gender dysphoria being one of them, we have to ask, what is it that's causing this change? Why are we seeing it now? And so I don't have an answer for that, but I put that out there as we're seeing a lot more young girls present as trans than we ever did before. We're seeing more adolescents present as trans than we ever did before. When historically, gender dysphoria has been presented, particularly in young male children, prior to the age of 7. Historically, the treatment in particular for adolescents has been watchful waiting, meaning you present to your provider and say, I think I'm trans, and your provider says, let's talk about it. Let's think about it for a while, because if you're a young female and I start giving you testosterone shots, those shots will physically change you in a way that cannot be undone, right? So if you decide at 15, I'm really this way, you could, and I start giving you shots, your body will change in a way that can't be undone later on. If you're like, I was just going through a hard phase and I'm wrong. I was wrong. And I really am a woman and not a man. I can't undo that. And same for males. So if you're a future provider, my point is we should treat these people with respect, and allow them to, allow their providers to work with them. Because there's a trans woman economist named Deirdre McCluskey who I profoundly admire. I've met her a couple of times, and she's a fantastic human being. And she's probably one of the smartest people in the world, right? And so, there's nothing, I have no prejudice against trans people, but I think we need to think about why are we seeing so much more of that now? And there probably there may be a good reason. I don't know what that is. So that's out there. So special populations in healthcare broadly. So I said there's a whole range of kind of populations that we could talk about. Women, right? Biologically female people. Historically, we've just referred to them as women. Have different biological needs. Females are the only sex that can have children, right? Males have different needs as well. We're biologically different from each other. Children have unique needs, right? They have developmental needs. If you don't give children, adequate vitamins, if you don't provide them, a nurturing environment, right? Your brain actually matures differently if you grow up in a household that is violent, that does not provide you stability. Your brain actually matures in a different way. You mature in a much more, when you are under stress, your body releases different hormones, and it causes, the longer those stress hormones are present in your body, it changes the way your brain develops. So children that grow up with a sense of danger their brains develop differently, right? And they are kind of programmed forever for more fight or flight responses. Which partly explains some of the intergenerational abuse that you might see. So children have special needs. The elderly have special needs, right? One 80-year-old person is different from another 80-year-old person, but broadly they're in a category you're going to start looking for cognitive decline, right? And it happens at different rates. So you can't treat one person the same as another. Some 80-year-olds are brilliant and could probably run circles around most of us in this room. Some 80-year-olds, have dementia and Alzheimer's and other challenges. We've already talked about LGBTQ plus, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. I've touched a little bit on religion, right? We have to keep in mind that religion is a profoundly powerful thing. People are willing to die for their religious beliefs. So you have to treat them with an appropriate respect. They also tend, along with racial and ethnic divisions, they tend to be treated, people of a particular religious minority, so this kind of whole group tends to have different treatment in society. As I'm sure we've been talking a lot about as a society of how we treat different groups. And even within those groups, you have a whole range of diverse experiences. So you don't want to treat one minority the same as the next minority, even if they're from the same minority group, because they're individuals and they've had their own individual life experiences. But you need to be aware of some of the common experiences that they may share. Class makes a huge difference, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Growing up in a low income family is likely to impact your nutrition, again, your safety, whether you grew up in a safe and stable environment. If you grew up in a rural area, You'll have some challenges. Access to care is a challenge. We've talked a lot about that. And then incarceration. I've got a slide to talk about it. Next slide is about talk about incarcerated individuals, which we've hinted at. So let's talk a little bit about. So all of these have challenges. Your book talks some more about each of those. Let's talk about incarceration. I've got a video I've asked you to watch about Angola prison and the hospice at Angola. When I lived in Louisiana, living, I really, if you've only lived in New England your whole life, or, you really need to go live someplace else for a little while, whether that's, and you don't even need to go overseas. The United States is such an enormous country. You need to go live in the South for a couple of years to test it out, see what it's like. It's different, right? It's got pluses and minuses, but it's a different, we're not a homogenous society. One of the things that I remember from like living in Louisiana is you're walking down the street in downtown Leesville, where I lived. You're walking down the street, people pass you by, they're always going, hey, how you doing? How you doing? They don't know you. They're just like, hey, how's it going? I mean, imagine doing that in Boston. Like nobody talks to you in Boston. You'd be like, what are you, some sort of creeper? You're talking to me and telling me to have a good day? What's wrong with you? Right? Don't tell me to have a good day. I have a right to have a crappy day if I want to have a crappy day. Don't talk to me like that, right? But if you in Louisiana, if you walk by somebody like you would do in Boston, they'd think you were very rude. You didn't say hello. How's it going? As you walk by. That's a minor cultural difference, but it's very much there, right? So in the South, there's a much more of a, and my wife and I, joke about it because people would say to my wife, who's a very friendly person, I had no idea you were from, New Hampshire. I thought everybody in New Hampshire was mean. They'd say that. So they have their beliefs about us right down there. They're like, everybody in New Hampshire is very rude, very rude. Doesn't talk. They're not friendly at all. So living in Louisiana, I was running the finance department for Bain Jones Army Community Hospital, and one of my a group of folks from my manpower section invited me to come with them to the Angola prison rodeo, which I think I have a little clip about. So Angola is a supermax prison. I mean, it's a full range prison. It is the state penitentiary for Louisiana. So it includes everything all the way up to supermax, which is where you send your most hardened, most vicious, dangerous criminals down to kind of like a work farm where basically you're free to roam all day, because you have demonstrated that you're not a flight risk. And so virtually free, but not. And Angola is on an island, and you don't want to swim in the rivers around Louisiana because there's alligators and other nasty, and snakes and all kinds of nasties. So I said, a prison rodeo, how fascinating. So we went, and it is one of those cultural experiences. They have, so every year they have a rodeo, and and you go to sit in the stadium. They let civilians onto the island, right? So non-prisoners onto the island. And you go into a state. First, they have a craft fair, which is really fascinating. So they have prisoners selling crafts that they've made. And so you can go to the craft fair and this is really fascinating. The prisoners who are, you go into the prison grounds. So you're in the walls at this point, and you're at the craft fair, and there are prisoners sitting like right here, like we can shake hands or whatever. We're not supposed to touch them. And they've got, whatever they've been making. I remember there was one guy who had made a great big, like 3-masted schooner out of matchsticks. And I looked at him like, that's amazing. It's like, I'm like, I remember saying, that's incredible. He's like, well, you can buy it. And I'm like, sorry, I don't know what I would do with a 3-foot model of a schooner made out of matchsticks, but that is really, really cool stuff. So that was really interesting. So you'd be intermingling with the prisoners, and then off to the side, there was this other section where there were tables with other crafts that had been made, so paintings and stuff. And then off to the side was a fenced, like chain link fence. And there were a bunch of prisoners standing on the other side of the fence. And if you like went up to, oh, this is a very nice craft, some guy, that's, that's my thing, I made it. And it's like, $25 for, And so those guys were not trusted enough to mingle with the rest of the crowd. So they had to like shout and stuff. And you had to, if you were interested in something, you didn't pay them cash. You took a slip and you brought it to them and they signed it. And then you took it to the cashier and they got them, and you paid the cashier and they put money in their prison account. So that was a really fascinating experience. Like walking around, I'm like, what did these guys do? That they're here, because this is not a like we talked about, jail versus prison, right? Jail, you're in for less than a year. Prison, you're there for at least a year. So they did they had to have done something bad. But the people who you're mingling with have achieved a level of trust that they're allowed to mingle with civilians, at least for this one day. So that's really fascinating. And then seeing the guys behind the fence who had not yet quite achieved that level of trust with the system. Just a fascinating thing, walking through there. And then you go to the rodeo, and the rodeo is this big stadium. Have you guys ever been to a rodeo? Any of you been to rodeos? It's not really a New England thing. Okay, yeah. So it's not really, you've been, okay, great. So it's not really a New England thing necessarily, but I, again, would suggest you should go to one someday, to experience the whole pageantry of it. And, it's a whole thing that people are very engaged with, more in the South and the West than we are up here. You go to the rodeo, and the prisoners don't ride horses. That's not, so you have a rodeo without horses, without the prisoners riding horses. So they have a variety of weird things that you would not see at a rodeo. So normally, like a rodeo, you might see, them riding. And they do like, I think, yeah, they do like bull riding, right, where you get thrown off the bull and that. They don't ride like and do roping from a horse, that kind of thing. So what they do instead are things like they do cowboy poker. And what cowboy poker is, does anybody know what cowboy, am I telling, does anybody know about this at all? Okay, good. You can totally YouTube all this stuff. Like there's a zillion YouTube videos of the Angola prison rodeo. I'm not making this stuff up. You can, cowboy poker is they put a card table in the middle of the arena, and then they put 4 prisoners sitting around the table, and they all hold cards as if they were playing poker. They're wearing bulletproof vests and helmets, and then they release a bull into the arena, and the rodeo clowns kind of poke at the bull and guide the bull over to the table, and the last guy sitting at the table wins cowboy poker. So that huge bull, and you'll see in the videos, you'll see guys getting scooped up by, like, they're sitting in the chair and the bull goes and like scoops them up on their horns and throws them up into the air, right? So whoever's last at the table wins cowboy poker. And the big event at the end is, and you win $100. Win $100. They tape or glue a coin to the nose of a bull, of a great big bull. And whoever pulls the coin off the angry bull wins $100. Would you try to pull something off the nose of a bull for $100? I sure as hell wouldn't. And like, there was one guy, the one time I went, the guy who had won it the year before, they bring the bull out and he's all like mad, right? And all the guys are kind of standing back. They're all kind of like terrified. They're like, what the hell am I doing? And the guy who had won the event the year before, the bull starts charging at the group and everybody starts backing up. And the guy who won the event the year before just stands there like this in front of the bull, and the bull just went plowed him over. And he didn't get it that year. But that's, so I tell all that not just because it's really fascinating, culturally fascinating, but think about the life you lead in prison if you are willing to do that, in particular that last event, for $100, right? Think about the life you're leading in that environment where $100 would be worth standing in front of an angry bull. So there are unique challenges to that. And one of the things that, you know, after my wife and I went and we had kind of been like, oh, it's so nice of my colleagues to invite us to come, and, you know, and it was partly a test. Like, it was partly a test, like, all right, is this Northerner willing to come to one of our like really culturally specific Southern events, and how is he going to react? And I have to say, my wife and I talk about it, you know, every now and then, like, what the heck was that? You know, and then we feel bad about it because, you know, you've got this population. Can you really say that these guys are voluntarily participating in this event, right? And if you ask the prisoners, if you ask the wardens, they'll say, of course they are. They don't have to do this. We totally offer it to them, you know. Well, if you're if you have a chance of, if you make 7 cents a day working 10 hours a day in the fields of Louisiana, which is what they do, they take them, the prison has its own farm, and they raise their own food, and they have, you know, so different tasks, and they get paid some paltry thing, you know, like 50 cents a day, right? So at, say, 50 cents a day, you know, that's like a year. $100 is like something close to a year's salary, right? So all of a sudden, maybe that starts to look a little more appealing. But when you put people into a situation where their best opportunities are physical danger, they may behave in different ways. Prison is a horrible environment by design, right? It's not meant to be fun. Right, that they refer to as the pains of imprisonment, right, is the loss of autonomy. We've talked about that last time. Is the loss of autonomy, the loss of ability to guide your own life, the inability to have relationships with the people you would like to choose. You can't choose who you want to have relationships with. You get put in a cell with somebody that you may or may not be able to get along with, that may or may be violent, right? And so in prison, you have high levels of physical violence because there are rarely enough guards. So I think we talked a little bit about like a story from nursing homes, right? Not enough LNAs to take care of all the patients, right? Similarly, in a prison, there's never enough guards to make sure that everybody stays safe. So in order to keep yourself safe, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're willing to be physically violent. In order to do that, right, in order to stay safe, you have to periodically, you have to demonstrate that you have a willingness to defend yourself and be physically violent. So prisoners face regular physical violence. They face sexual violence, male prisoner, male on male sexual violence in prisons as part of that dynamic, and you can't get out of it. So you have, and then you have, you know, do I really want to go work 10 hours in the field for 50 cents? Well, if I can convince the doctor that I'm sick, I can, you know, I can stay in my prison cell and read a book or something else, right? Or I can hang out on the infirmary. So there's a situation where the provider that's providing care to the prisoners is dealing with, the prisoners are trying to manipulate the healthcare system to get things they want, right? To maybe get out of a cell that they're assigned to, or get out of work that they don't want to do, get assigned to a better part, right? Maybe being in a psychiatric ward in a prison is regarded as being better than being in regular population. And so they may try to pretend to have psychiatric illness. We already said that a lot of them do have psychiatric illness. It's part of why they're there, because we have a crappy mental health system in the United States with not enough providers. So the prisoners are very, they're very smart. I mean, human beings are just in general, on average, are smart, right? Prisoners happen to be criminals, but they're still intelligent, and they're able to observe the incentives around them, and they respond to those incentives. So faking illness might get them what they want. I talked with a former prison physician who is a psychiatrist, he's dual residency qualified as both a psychiatrist and an internal medicine doctor. And so he was an ideal physician to be the medical director for a prison infirmary. And he talked about, he mentioned like there was a guy who would regularly swallow things in order to get taken to the hospital because he just wanted to get out of the prison. He just wanted a day out, so he would swallow whatever he could get a hold of. And then they'd have to take him to, the hospital. And then he would get, he'd get to see non-prison people for a day or two. And then they'd, bring him back, and then he'd swallow something else. And then they'd have to take him out again, right? So that's the kind of unique challenges that face, aside from sexual violence, physical violence, sexual violence, attempts at malingering, which is when you try to avoid work, right? You also have, kind of all sorts of self-harm issues. And then there's high levels of substance abuse, right? So drugs get into the prisons. The guards are often poorly paid. And so they're easily manipulated by the prisoners. Sometimes the guards and the guards' families live in the same communities that the prisoners are from. And so you have this overlap between the guard and his family and the prisoner and their family. And so the guard can be subjected to intimidation when he's not on duty or she's not on duty. So that's a possibility, right? And so, and other so guards and other employees of the prison bring contraband into the prison to include drugs, alcohol, as well as cell phones and other things. So I did a bunch of research on prisons. There's some fascinating stuff out there about different, if you're interested in this topic, it's not necessarily healthcare per se, but it's just fascinating about the economy of a prison. There's a great book, by the way, called The God of the Rodeo, which is all about Angola prison. If you're interested in like learning what living in a supermax prison is like, it talks about the rodeo and why they participate in the rodeo. And I just still have really mixed feelings about rodeo. I'm sometimes embarrassed that I participated in it because I feel like I participated in something that's unethical. And at the same time, it is a different culture. And I'm not sure it actually, so I really I walked the line, like, was it ethical? Was it not ethical? I kind of go back and forth. And if you read the book, The God of the Rodeo, it's an excellent book. And it really leaves you with kind of like, I'm not sure which way that go on that. But there's I've asked you to watch a video about hospice at Angola. And it's a really lovely video. It's about 17 minutes. It's definitely worth watching. And there is a full length feature film by Forrest Whitaker about the hospice at Angola as well. So it's like a 90-minute video that I would really recommend. It's excellent. So if you get sentenced to life in Louisiana, life in prison in Louisiana, you're going to Angola if you go through the state court system. So if you murder somebody, for example, and you get life in prison, you will spend the rest of your life in Angola. Right? You might get to do the rodeo, you might not. You might get to do the craft fair, you might not. Right? But you're never leaving Angola ever. And so the rest of your life, you're going to be in this prison. And that's just one prison, right? New Hampshire has a state prison where people who commit murder or whatever go spend the rest of their life in. Every state does. And then we have federal penitentiaries where people who commit federal crimes and get sentenced to life spend the rest of their lives. We have a federal prison in Berlin, New Hampshire, for example. So what kind of challenges do we have? Well, we have mental illness, all sorts of mental illness challenges, right? Prisoners come in with mental illness, and then if you didn't have a mental illness when you got there, try to imagine a life led in an institution like that. And I'm pretty sure I'd develop a mental illness of some, I would certainly become, a different person over time. And I would say that it probably would be something like mental illness. And so the prison system has to recognize that, and they have to balance. They have to run a balance between prison is a punishment. It is meant to be a punishment. It's not meant to be a nice place to be. But they have to balance that with treating the individual there, subjecting the individual to the punishment intended, but not more than that, right? So if you're sentenced to prison for 5 years for embezzlement or for selling cocaine or something like that, the intended punishment is you get taken away from the world for 5 years. You live in a total institution where you have no autonomy. But the sentence is not to be beaten and raped on a regular basis, right? That's not or to develop a mental illness such that you attempt suicide. That's not the intention of prison, right? Prison is, there's a level of punishment that's intended, but there are potential other consequences. So a prison has to walk a line between punishment that's intended versus what's possible. And healthcare is a piece of that, right? If you go into prison, so I read some stories about, a guy who went for embezzlement, he was stealing from his company. He had a heart condition. Well, he couldn't convince the prison doctor that his heart condition was worsening because the prison doctor thought he was trying to malinger. He was trying to avoid work, and the guy's heart condition worsened and he eventually died because he couldn't get the appropriate care. So there's these challenges that prison presents that I think they're unique in that sense. So coming back to the hospice, which I'm going to ask you to watch the video about, it's really touching. I think it's a touching video because you have these men, and I believe Angola is all men. You have these men who are sentenced to life and are dying. And now they're dying, right? So at some point you're going to die. If you're sentenced to life, you're going to die. You may die as an old man, or you may die, from cancer or heart disease or something else, right? So hospice, we talked about, you have to have 6 months left. You have to have a diagnosis that says you have 6 months left to live. So they have a special wing where if you are have such a diagnosis, you are admitted to prison hospice. And they have providers, of course, but then the people who actually run the hospice are fellow prisoners, which I think is really cool, right? And so the people who provide the low-level nursing support for the patients, the prisoner patients, are fellow prisoners. So they're trained to do like LNA type duties, right? And then they sit vigil with them when they're dying. And it's a really beautiful thing. And when you look at it, you're like, wow, well, so the guy on the right is a double murderer and the guy on the left is a double murderer, and look at them together, helping one another have a dignified death, because we all, deserve, that, right? Because the point here is the punishment was not to have an undignified death. The punishment was that you will die in prison. Right, that's life imprisonment, right? It is not for you to be tortured, to be abused, but to have that appropriate, society has determined that you need to spend the rest of your life in prison for the crimes you committed. They were no doubt heinous, but now that we've done that to you, we do no more than, we want to prevent from doing more than that, right? And so hospice is one way of kind of striking that balance and it's provided by fellow prisoners. And that gives the process of caring, the process of providing that care, provides dignity to the individuals who provide it, and it provides dignity to the individuals who receive it. So if you're wanting to try to create an environment where people are less likely to be doing terrible things to each other, you want to provide them a way of achieving a certain level of human dignity. And so if you talk to a good warden, I think, you'll hear them talk about that. And so, providing that level of dignity goes back to our what is health, right? What is health? Is it absence of disease? No, it's not just absence of disease. It is having, having a overall level of satisfaction and fulfillment. So within the framework of the punishment that these individuals have earned through the things that they have done, right? We want to provide them the ability to achieve a level of health and well-being that each human being deserves. So check out that video. I recommend the Forrest Whitaker video as well. All right. And the other thing, I just want to say one other point about this, and then I'll move on from prison. The other thing about this population is once you take someone and put them into a total institution, right? So once you put someone to prison, they no longer have the ability to care for themselves. That is entirely their ability to care for themselves. The ability for them to care for themselves is largely removed, right? So then you as the agency that is putting them in that position have an obligation to provide them with a minimum level of care, right? So when we put someone in prison, we have to provide them, we have an obligation to provide them with a certain level of care. So, and that includes both kind of maintenance of health as well as medical care, right? So maintenance of health includes spiritual and mental health. All right, that's pretty dark. So let's talk about populations thinking about race. So, I think, and I think I've made this point, that health and wealth are tightly connected. So when we talk about race as a special population, this is household income. So this is taken from the Census Bureau, US Census Bureau. And the numbers are that 2019 dollars means that all the numbers are inflated so that they are in 2019 dollars. So I think kind of an ongoing theme in this class has been, if you don't have enough money, you're not going to get healthcare. You're not going to be able to afford healthcare. And so what are the challenges that we face? Well, we have, white is kind of our standard. Asian population on average, Asian households on average are the highest earners, white is second, Hispanic third, and Black last. So on average, then you would say by race, certain groups are going to have less of an ability to access healthcare because they have less household income, and household income is a clear determinant of access to healthcare. It is also a determinant of access to quality schooling. It is an access to quality housing, and it's a clear indicator of who has the best jobs, right? So, so all of those things contribute to overall health. There's a different way of looking at it, this by quintile. And so this is the dollar amount earned by household by quintile. So what do I mean? So you divide up a population into fifths. Quintile is 5. So I take the lowest 20% of the lowest 20 the lowest 20% earners, households earning lowest, I'm trying to say this, lowest income, average income of the lowest fifth. So this is the average of each fifth. So if you are Asian and in the lowest fifth of the population by income, your average income is going to be 20,000 per year. The next fifth up, so you're in the bottom 40%. The average of the 20 to 40 is 58,000. The middle 98,000, and then fourth and fifth. So if you're in the 60 to 80, your household on average makes 153. The highest 20%, 334. And then the tippity top 5%, I guess it's not. So we've been talking about 1%ers, but these are the 5%ers. So the top 5% make 577 on average, but they go out much further than that, right? So like the CEO of Google is an Indian American, I believe, and he makes, hundreds of millions. Yes. In United States. Yep. Yeah. So then you see white non-Hispanic, right? And you can see the distributions. So who needs help? So my point in showing this as divided up by fifths is, if you're out here on the top 5%, right, regardless of which line you're on, if you're out here on the top 5%, you don't need any help. I mean, that's kind of, right? Like, you're probably doing okay. If you're in this highest fifth, even at 100, even if you're on the bottom 177,000, you're probably doing okay. That's a lot of money, right? But when you start to slide to 75, depends on your household size, right? If you've got 4 or 5 people at 75, you might start to see some challenges. For sure, if you hit 45 and you're a household of more than 2 or 3 people, you're going to have some challenges funding healthcare, right? And you could kind of go down. So it kind of, goes down like this, if you will, going, say, from middle fifth in the Asian population, middle fifth white, probably okay, kind of. But now you're down, when you're getting down into 56,000, right, Hispanic at middle fifth, that's probably going to have some impact on your ability to access healthcare. It's going to probably have not only access to healthcare, but access to good housing, safe neighborhoods, good food, right? You're probably more likely to live in a food desert, probably less. So the problem of poverty, or being poor, is you have less access to everything that's good in life, right? So I guess I, as an economist, tend to look more at income, and I tend to weight income and class more than race. Other people focus on race, but I say, if you're a Hispanic making $297,000 a year, you probably don't, you probably have fewer challenges than if you're a white household in the bottom fifth making $17,000 a year, right? So I think it's worth considering how we give out supports, and do we tie them more to income, or do we tie them to an arbitrary something like race? Okay. You can make an argument, I think, in multiple ways, but I don't see giving a lot of support to people in the top 5% when it's coming from potentially people in the lower end, right? So for example, whites in the top 5% making $485,000 a year. When they turn 65 or 62, they can start taking Social Security. When they turn 65, they get Medicare. And yeah, they're going to have to pay $180 a month for Medicare. So if you're Warren Buffett, richest investor in the world, you guys know Warren Buffett name, right? So, or, pick any of your old fogies who are billionaires that you know who they are. When they turn 65, they get Medicare, right? Which means they pay, $180 a month, I think is the top, might be $200 a month, is the top cost for Medicare right now. But if you're a billionaire, you get Medicare at $200 a month. And do you know who's subsidizing them? So you all, in your $12 an hour job, at the juicery or at Starbucks or wherever it is you work to earn your pocket change, right? When they take out the Medicare taxes out of and Social Security taxes out of your paycheck, they go universally to everybody who's over 62 or 65, 65 for Medicare, regardless of whether they're in the low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum. So for me, I'd say I'd rather see a more tightly means tested program that, if you have, $1 billion in the bank, maybe you don't qualify for Medicare ever. Maybe if you have an income of $200,000 a year, you don't qualify for Medicare, period. But there's a lot of resistance to that. The alternative perspective is we're all in this together. And in order to get the rich people to support this program for the poor people, we have to give it to the rich people too. That's the basic kind of argument that happens behind the curtain when the policy people get together, is they say, we're not going to get any votes for a benefit like Medicare unless we make it universal. And the proof is when you look at the Medicaid benefit that's means tested, meaning it only qualifies for poor people, right? That benefit's kind of crappy relative to Medicare, which is much, much richer, even though Medicaid is the one that's going to the people who by definition are on the left side of this, right? Left side of this chart. So that's the proof that they're right, that when a benefit is proposed for poor people, people in America tend to talk a big talk about wanting to give to poor people, but when it comes down to it, they tend to say poor people probably are poor because they're lazy. That's our kind of culture, and it is, whether you say, oh no, we don't really believe that or not. When you look at the programs we put into place, they're actually put into place. The programs for poor people are stingy, and the programs for everybody are quite generous. So I would say, so I would encourage you to take a nuanced, so my point here is to take a nuanced look at when people talk about disparities, to also bear in mind that there's a whole range of people in any one of these categories, some of whom really need help, right? People on this end of the spectrum, regardless of which line they're on, these people really need help. And the people on this end of the spectrum really don't need help. Right? I'd be ashamed if I was Warren Buffett and I was taking Medicare and Social Security. All right. So along that line is this idea called the social gradient. So this is talking about race and ethnicity. Another thing we don't talk a lot about in the United States is class. So if you go to Great Britain, to UK, the UK is a very class based society. And I've never lived there. I've listened to people talk about what it's like to live there. So I'm definitely giving this to you secondhand. I listened to a guy named Andrew Sullivan, who's a public intellectual. He is regarded as the person who he's generally regarded as the leader of the marriage equality effort. He grew up in working class, I forget where, working class England, was an exceptionally intelligent young man, and wound up going to Oxford, which is kind of their Harvard equivalent. So it is, he went to the highest. He actually went through college with Boris Johnson, the current prime minister. So I listened to his podcast and he periodically talks about how Boris Johnson was, he doesn't really like him. But he talks about the fact that having grown up in a working class environment, he had a working class accent. And when you go to a place like Oxford, which is like Harvard, right, where most of the people at Harvard are filthy rich, their legacies, meaning that mom and dad went to Harvard, or, and before that, grandma and grandpa went to Harvard, and before that, great grandpa went to Harvard because they didn't let women in back then, and and so on, right? So these people have been going to Harvard forever, and it's one of the ways that they maintain their position in society. And so they can detect they can tell if you're wealthy or not by your accent, by the clothes you wear, right? By the car you drive. Quick conversation. Oh, where'd you do your vacation? Oh, I went to Disney World. Oh, you're middle class. Because I went to Paris, whatever. And I went to Aspen skiing last weekend, and and so they can sniff you out pretty quickly. But he said, Andrew Sullivan talks about how it's even worse in England, because that's the axis they care more about than race or ethnicity, though they all play in together. And so, as soon as you open your mouth and start talking, they can hear your accent. They're like, oh, you're from, working class, part of the country. And they immediately slot you into a level and how you're treated. In the United States, we tend to be less class oriented, though we definitely include, though class is definitely a reality. All you have to do is look around, look in your bureau drawers and look at the brands on your clothing, and you will know which class you belong to. So England and Great Britain being a very class society, they did this very interesting study called the Whitehall studies. Whitehall is like, it is the center of their national government. It's where all the, I want to say it's like the Pentagon, but it's not just military. So it's like where all the departments of government for the national government have their offices. So you have the Secretary of State, and then you have the State Department and all the little doobies that work in the State Department. So you have, the Secretary of State, and then the, Deputy Assistant to the Undersecretary of State, and yada, yada. So you have all these high, big wigs, right? And then it works its way down to the folks who work in the mailroom at the Department of State, right? So you have, everybody from, high muckety mucks that all went to Harvard together, all the way down to people who maybe are high school dropouts who are sweeping the floor. So they're all in this building called Whitehall. And it's not just state, it's other, I don't know the government structure of Britain. So it's all these departments, that there are all these people that work and run the federal government work at Whitehall. So they did this huge study looking at British civil servants. So these are people that work for the government, right? Civil servants working for the government. And what they found was people who were at the top of the hierarchy, right? The people who are like the assistant deputy to the secretary or whatever are up here making, good money, and then you have down here kind of your working class people who are maybe, like I said, doing maintenance in the building or whatever, right? What they found was that the people at the lowest income level, lowest grades, were 6 times as likely to die from coronary heart disease. And there's a whole slew of just bad things, right? There was a fairly high level of alcoholism at all levels, but it was also pretty high. It was especially high at the lower levels. There was higher levels there were higher levels of obesity, right? People who were at the lower levels were more likely to smoke, and so forth. So what they took from that was living as a lower socioeconomic status, SES. So if you do public health kind of work, SES is the phrase we use for socioeconomic status. Implies where do you fit in the hierarchy of society? Are you a top 5% person, or are you down in that lower quintile, or maybe second to lowest quintile, right? And so what they found was a clear relationship between where you fit in on the social hierarchy, as well as income. And then they controlled for income. And they said, okay, So we know that the people at the top make more money than the people at the bottom. They control for income, and they find that if we try to do our best to pull income out of this consideration, how does that impact? And they still found a direct relationship between health outcomes and social status. So they're pulling out, controlling for income. And so what they evaluated was that feeling and being lower socioeconomic status creates stress. So when you walk into the building and you know that you're the janitor, or you know you're the person at the coffee line, and that's your life, right? You feel worse about yourself when you have to serve all these upper level muckety mucks who you know all their names, but they probably don't know who you are, right? And so people at these lower level jobs, knowing that they are regarded as lower class, have higher levels of stress, which we talked about before. If you live with stress over time, it causes harm to your body. And so you wind up with all these negative health behaviors. And then coping mechanisms for those things are things like, so coping mechanisms for feeling badly are often eating too much, smoking, drinking too much, right? I don't know about you, I'm a huge stress eater. Right now with my kids living in my house, and I told you about the fire and all that, right? I got the kids living at the house, I got 4 cats, and we're trying to find a place for them to live, and we tried to buy a house that I could rent to them, and that fell through, and yada yada. So I'm feeling very stressed. And so I about 10 o'clock last night, there was a bag of chips, and now the bag of chips is no more. Right. So that's how I deal with my stress. And I tend to drink too much beer too, but I don't drink beer during the week. So probably come Friday, I may have a couple of beers too, maybe too many. So depending on whether they're still in my house or not, which they probably will be. So stress comes from, because we are social animals, and we are actually hardwired to create hierarchies, right? You young women in the audience probably dealt with mean girls in high school, right? Hopefully you weren't one of them. But young girls tend to create social hierarchies that are much meaner than young men, and cause greater stress. Girls tend to, on average, tend to have more mental health issues in adolescence. And I can speak to that as a father of 3 lovely young women. The teen years were god awful. Just wait till you guys have kids. They're so adorable when they're little, right? And then they grow up and they have opinions. And none of it is right. And I just got told that this morning from my youngest, who still lives with us. Anyway, so Whitehall studies are famous. So they use this phrase social gradient, which means it's like goes down, right? So the farther down you are on the social gradient, the more stress you have, independent of wealth, which I've focused on a lot. Wealth also, by the way, combines with that. But even controlling for wealth, knowing that you are regarded as lower in the socioeconomic status game, causes stress, which then causes long-term illness. All right, so we'll stop there and finish up next time.